When a human has a fault, it's called a blemish or maybe a personality quirk. When an IC has a fault, it's called a big deal. When an automotive IC has a fault, it's called a really big deal. It could mean a matter of life and death. So, how do we run a successful fault campaign that will help us mitigate random faults defined by the ISO 26262 standard? You could start with this here Chalk Talk. Hi, I'm Amelia Dalton, host of Chalk Talk. In this episode of Chalk Talk, Keffer and Robert Serphillips from Siemens EDA and I explore how the Siemens EDA functional safety platform can guide your team through the complete ISO 26262 lifecycle. We also examine the benefits that the Veloce Fault App brings to automotive IC designs, and how you can take advantage of Siemens EDA full suite of functional tools for your next automotive IC design. And before we get started, don't forget to click that link. There you can find even more information about this topic from Siemens EDA. Hi, Anne. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
And hi, Robert. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Amelia. It's good to talk to you.
Excellent. Okay, so we are talking about how we can accelerate time to fault campaign success with Siemens EDA today. But before we dig into the details, can you set the stage for us? And we're talking about a broad range of functional safety applications and markets, right?
Right. Well, there's a number of safety critical markets, most of which are governed by a standard or some sort of safety standard, starting with automotive all the way to trains, railway. But the focus of this presentation is on the automotive functional safety, specifically ISO 26262.
Fantastic. Now, what about functional safety in the automotive sector in particular? What kind of faults are we talking about here?
When you look at faults in the automotive sector, for this presentation, we're going to talk about systematic faults and random faults. So ISO 26262 is really for semiconductor suppliers, and it guides the development of safe ICs. When you talk about systematic faults, those are the faults that are eliminated through your good design, your verification flow, and your test methodology. So it's eliminating design bugs, it's uncovering incomplete specs and manufacturing defects. When you talk about random faults, we're talking about faults that aren't designed or can't be designed out. They need to be caught by safety mechanisms. So safety mechanisms must be put into the design to detect and mitigate those random faults. When we talk about SOTIF, which is outside of the scope of this presentation, that's another standard that actually looks at system faults and ensures that automotive systems operate safely under all scenarios and environmental conditions. And then when you talk about malicious faults, that's really security. So it's covered by ISO 21434, and that ensures that automotive systems are safe from any kind of malicious attack. But again, this presentation or this talk really focuses on ISO 26262 and the methodology around that standard.
So Siemens has a broad footprint in the automotive industry, right?
Yeah, it really does. If you look at the slide, if you go from left to right, we have leading digital twin technology from vehicle to systems to semiconductor, and we've invested really heavily over the past 2 decades. We're engaged with key industry leaders, as you see in the center here, and those are in both open ecosystems as well as direct partnerships. And then we really are innovative. We participate and drive through all of these standards that we talked about in the first slide. So we participate in all those standards to drive innovation.
Can we take a closer look at each of the aspects of the Siemens Automotive IC safety platform? What all does this platform include?
Well, let's take a look at it from a really high level. There's really 4 different parts to this platform. And the first part is lifecycle management, and that's the umbrella term that encapsulates all the processes and lifecycle activities that are required by ISO 26262 for a safety critical lifecycle. And then if you go to the next area, and that's eliminating systematic failures. I mentioned that before, but ISO 26262 also talks about how to eliminate those systematic failures. So the fundamental objective of this is to ensure that the product, when manufactured, is bug-free and operates as required. And then the third box is really to ensure the design fails safely during the operational life of the IC. So the objective is really to mitigate random faults, to analyze them and protect the design against those faults. And then finally, services. In addition to solutions and methodology, we provide the expertise to guide and supplement engineering teams through their safety lifecycle and the activities performed within.
Okay, so can you walk me through the workflow here?
Absolutely. I'm going to start here down at the bottom, number 1, which is lifecycle management. So our ALM, PLM solutions really guide project teams through safety planning and workflow definition. And it helps project teams put in place the configuration management, build management, impact analysis, and the requirements required to successfully complete a safety lifecycle. And then when you go to step 2, which is safety analysis, our tool Safety Scope guides project teams through the definition and helps them reach the optimal safety architecture for the design, given that ASIL target. It's like early metrics so that you understand if your design will meet those metrics before you go to fault injection, which is quite costly. If you go to the third part here, once the safety mechanisms are identified and you know what you want to actually add in, we have a suite of tools that automate the insertion of those safety mechanisms. So the insertion of hardware safety mechanisms like duplication or parity, ECC, and we can also leverage the hardware with mission mode to perform in-system tests. So our Tessent embedded analytics rounds out the insertion offering by putting together disparate safety mechanisms, BIST as well as hardware safety mechanisms. Then once those safety mechanisms are implemented and in the design, you need to verify the effectiveness of those safety mechanisms. And this is called a fault campaign or fault injection. And we provide several different tools that will do fault injection based on your fault campaign. So we have Kaleidoscope, which is digital fault injection. We'll be talking more about that tool today. We have Quest to analyze fault, which is through formal techniques. We have the Veloce Fault App, which we are also talking about today, and then Tessent Defect Sim, which is analog mixed signal. And then number 5 goes back to how do you provide your work products and generate those work products. So when you get certified, you really have to provide your safety case, your FMEA, your FMEDA, and that's what you have to provide to your auditor to get certification for ISO 262. And then lastly, number 6, those are really for companies that are interested in collecting real world feedback. So we do offer technology to feed in-system data back into cloud implementations where analytics and insights are performed. So really these insights are used to improve subsequent development processes, whether that's a variant chip or an entirely new design.
Fantastic. Now, what are the biggest issues with functional safety in this realm?
Well, there's a lot of issues and challenges in this realm. Really, it's validating that the expert judgment is a true judgment of safety metrics. It's eliminating inaccurate results, identifying the optimal safety architecture early. And you want to do that early because, again, when you get to fault injection, that's a very costly part of the flow. It takes a lot of time. Optimizing fault campaigns, there's many ways to optimize a fault campaign, from using the right tools in the methodology to optimizing your fault list, classifying all faults, and then debugging too. Debugging is a really big challenge because many vendors don't have specific tools to debug faults like undetected, unobserved faults, whether they're safe or not. So those are really some of the biggest challenges that we're seeing with customers today.
Okay, so let's talk about failure modes, effects, and diagnostic analysis. Can you walk us through the workflow that will take us from requirements to this kind of analysis?
Certainly. So this really does reflect that wheel that I talked about earlier, the 1 through at least 5 of that wheel. Basically, you start with lifecycle management. And with lifecycle management, again, our tool is Polarian. That's the Siemens application lifecycle management tool. That's where you start setting your safety goals. You start creating your FMEA. And that's kind of the beginning of the development, right? You make sure that you have a safety environment. And there's a lot of things that are outlined by the ISO 26262 standard about getting ready to develop a safety critical IC. And then really from there, you're going to start creating your FM EDA, your failure modes, effects, and diagnostics analysis, which is really a mapping of your design to the failure modes, to the safety mechanisms that are designed in to mitigate those failures and mitigate faults, right? And we have something called Verification IQ, and that product has several different applications. One of those applications is to provide a collaborative web-based FMEDA. So that product will help you create your FMEDA if you don't already have one. If you do, you can import it into this tool, but it allows you to create that FMEDA and maintain that FMEDA throughout your safety workflow. Safety analysis is a really big part. I'll talk a little bit more about safety scope, but what safety analysis does is it looks at the design structurally and provides early metrics through that structural assessment. And that's fed back into that FMEDA, which is part of the Verification IQ platform. All of this information is stored in this common FUSA database. So, when you create an FMEDA, when you run safety analysis, safety scope to get early metrics, it's all stored in the FUSA database so that when you finally go down to fault injection and you do fault injection with Kaleidoscope or the Veloce Fault App, which is what we're talking about today, so simulation and emulation, then those metrics are again stored into this database so that you can pull it into your FMEDA and populate it with the validated metrics. And then again, you're going to have to debug. So, you're going to have to debug waveforms and you're going to have all this information available to actually do debug. So this common database allows for all of these tools in this flow to get to that information needed to complete fault campaigns for ISO 26262.
Can we also talk about safety scope as well? This helps with early metric assessment, right?
Right. And this is really key. Safety scope's really key. So what safety scope does is provides an accurate estimation of your diagnostic coverage while you're developing your design. So you can get early RTL. You might have some safety mechanisms in it. You run safety scope, and what it will provide you is an estimation of your fit and your diagnostic coverage. It will estimate the impact of those safety mechanisms that you've designed in, and you can explore ways of reaching the target ASIL level, whether it's B, C, or D, by exploring if I put additional safety mechanisms in different parts of my design, how does that affect the design? So safety scope helps you create that architecture, that optimal architecture early.
What about failure rate calculation? Can safety scope also help here?
That's exactly what I was talking about. When you start developing, you have early RTL, or it could be later in the design with GLS, depending on what you're doing. But let's say you've developed a module and you want to understand what the fit is, which is failures in time. So safety scope will structurally analyze that. And it's based on a lot of user input. So it looks at the target technology, it looks at the mission profile, it looks at the packaging information and packaging materials, and it takes that into consideration when it does the fit calculation. It uses the standards IEC 62380 and SN 29500. You can choose which standard you want to use to actually calculate fit. If you have a module or you have multiple modules, let's say, it will do a hierarchical analysis and roll it up to the top. Again, there's user input. It looks at the design and takes this user input and calculates fit based on those metrics that I just talked about. And then it'll give you a report. So it gives you a base metric report so you can see what the contribution is of those particular parts of your design on fit.
So earlier you mentioned Kaleidoscope as well. What kind of benefits are we looking at for this aspect of the platform?
Even though you have safety scope to do an analysis early in the design, right, and help you get to that optimal safety architecture. Most customers still do fault injection to prove that they've reached their ASIL level, and that's to get their certification. So some of the benefits of Kaleidoscope are it was designed with ISO 26262 in mind. So it's a high performance concurrent fault simulation tool. It takes advantage of the compute power by taking advantage of all the cores on a server, as well as all the servers in a grid. So it can take advantage of the whole compute power that you have available. It supports both fault injection and RTL for early classification. And then, of course, at gate level for certification, if you're getting like a D certification, which is gate level is recommended by the standard. So again, it's concurrent. It can use all the cores on a server, so it's multi-threaded, and it can access all the machines in your server farm for very, very high performance. Some of the inputs to Kaleidoscope, of course, are the design, whether it's RTL or gate level, the stimulus, so your test bench, right? You can have that in a QA, VCD, or FSDB format. So it doesn't matter what verification tool or verification simulator you use in your verification flow. It's agnostic. Then the alarms, as well as the fault list. And those are the inputs. And then what comes out is your FUSA report. And again, in that flow, again, this FUSA report goes into the database, and then it can be sucked into your FMEDA managed by the VIQ compliance advisor.
All right, great. Thank you so much for all of that information, Anne. So let's talk also about the Veloce Fault App. Tell me about how emulation fits into this flow.
Yeah. So basically, what we're seeing is that, as the designs are scaling in complexity and things like gate count, we're seeing a real big push to move away from traditional hardware based safety mechanisms, things like ECC and parity, and moving to more of a software based safety approach. So what's happening is now you have the customers, they have to boot their kernel, they have to boot the operating system, they have to boot all of their user software. So we're seeing that it's now billions of cycles to go through and validate this safety architecture, right? So they're looking to emulation to speed up some of those fault campaigns. So let me just really briefly, for those who aren't maybe familiar with emulation, kind of go through. This is the Veloce emulation and prototyping ecosystem, if you will. It's a hardware and software solution. On the bottom, I have the three chassis, the hardware chassis that we list. So the Veloce Strato CS, that is a traditional emulation machine. It scales in size, but it can handle anywhere from about 40 million gates to as high as 40 billion gates, depending on how many racks and stuff you put in there. In the middle is the Veloce Primo. That is an enterprise prototyping system that is an off-the-shelf AMD VP1902 FPGA. It's much faster than the Strato S, or excuse me, for the Strato CS, but it gives you that runtime to be able to more quickly validate that your software is working. Whereas the Strato CS is really designed to, as part of your design bring up, to make sure that the design, the logic is working. And then finally on the right, we have the Veloce Pro FPGA CS, which is also a prototyping AMD off-the-shelf 1902 FPGA that gives you super fast, think 20 to 30 megahertz worth of speed. And that's to validate that your entire system, the hardware, the software, and so on, is working as designed, if you will. And then on top of that, we have an operating system that is the command to control. And then we have solutions, things like memory and transactors libraries. And then finally, on top of all that, we have a set of applications. And I've highlighted the Veloce Fault App since that's the one we're going to be discussing today.
Fantastic. So I'm excited to talk more about this Veloce Fault App. But Robert, before we do, automotive IC development is quite a broad subject. But overall, What do you think are the biggest areas for a successful IC design in this arena?
Yeah. So when we sat down and looked at this space, it is very complex, but we narrowed it down to three fundamental activities, right? The safety analysis, design for safety, and finally the safety verification. Let me speak for a minute on what each of these boxes mean. So, safety analysis is what Ann mentioned earlier with the safety scope product. So, it does a structural vectorless analysis of the design. And at the end of the day, what it's accomplishing is generating the most highly optimized fault list. So it's using standard fault optimization techniques like cone of influence, both forward and reverse, things like shallow fault collapsing and equivalence, and things like statistical random sampling. The idea is to generate the smallest but most highly optimized fault list to meet your ASIL B, C, D needs, depending on the project. The second one is the design for safety. What this basically does is the tool will actually insert, it does an analysis and it tries to see where the design lacks some safety protocol. So it will actually insert either hardware or safety mechanisms to harden those areas to bring your overall safety rating up. And then finally, safety verification. This is the one that really the Veloce Fault App plays in. This is the act, and this is actually called out in the ISO 26262 spec, but you have to inject faults one by one, running your stimulus to see how those faults will impact the system, which brings us to if we're looking at a large design and we're looking at 500,000 faults, that could be a very long fault campaign in simulation, which is now one of the reasons why users are looking to emulation to speed up this entire process. So on this slide, what we're showing is basically the workflow. This is the Siemens EDA integrated fault injection solution. It contains products from the Veloce side with the Fault app, and it contains products that come from Ann's division, things like the Ostemper safety scope. And I'll really briefly walk you through how this process works. But on the left, the safety scope will analyze the design. It'll generate through those standard optimization features I mentioned earlier. It'll generate a fault list. What ties all these products together is the fault database. It is a multi-user, multi-session, multi-IP, so on and so forth. But those faults get uploaded to the database. Then we have in the center here of the slide, we have different execution engines, whether it's fault simulation, which is the kaleidoscope tool that Ann mentioned, or it's the Veloce Fault app. They can inject faults on these different platforms. They can do some light classification. And then finally, the results of both of those fault campaigns can be uploaded back into the fault database for final metric analysis and correlation.
Okay, so give me some details about the Veloce Fault app. What benefit does this app bring to automotive IC design?
What we've seen in the past is that at the end of the day, all of your workflow has to be certified, right? It has to be documented and certified to get your 26262 certification. So, what we found is that you have lots of various point tools to do lots of various jobs along the way, but there's really no safety manager. There's nothing to manage how data gets passed back and forth between the tools. A lot of times, the various point tools have incompatible data exchange. So, to have a system, an end to end system that contains not just all of the tools, but the ability to collate and manage your fault campaigns is of tremendous value. And then finally, as I mentioned, validation is the big bottleneck. You still have to go through and run the simulations, inject the faults. And what happens is that can take months. Sometimes we've seen it take over a year. So they're looking to emulation to speed that process up so that their time to certification can be shifted left earlier in the cycle. But some of the value of the app is that, we can help you accelerate that time to certification. Instead of it taking a year, we can bring that down to 3 months or 6 months. But really, some of the key features of emulation is that, as I mentioned earlier, you need to be able to handle those large, complex designs. So we're talking our platform can handle designs that are up to 40 billion gates. And that's a insanely huge design when you think about it. But we still need to be able to handle the full SoC, the full software stack, running all of the user software and the user safety mechanisms on top of all that. And then finally, really the main benefit that emulation brings to the table is the orders of magnitude faster acceleration than what you would see in traditional software simulation. This is a high-level overview on how the Fault app works. It's very straightforward. We have a concept of FINs and FDNs. So FINs are fault injection nets. Those are the nets that you've predefined at compile time to be able to inject a fault at. So you can define a net without actually having to define the fault type at compile. And then this concept of FDN, that's the fault detection net, that is the safety mechanism. That is the GPIO pin that goes high in the event of a fault. That is a software mechanism that reads a register in the detection presence of a fault. And then finally, what you would do is a golden run. So after compile, we run the design with the absence of faults. So no faults are injected, but we're gaining insight into how the design cycle for cycle is supposed to run in a normal type of scenario. And then finally, you do your fault injection run, where now we save away the golden run, we inject fault, and we compare the differences of those FINs and the FDNs to how it ran in the golden run. And we can immediately tell you where there's deviation between the golden run and then the fault injection run. So this is a typical way that the user would compile. Basically, you specify the FusaDB and the fault app switch in your Veloce config file. That Veloce config file and the FusaDB path contains the list of FINs and FDNs. That is what specifies the fault list. That is the nets that you want to inject faults on. And the FDNs are your software or hardware safety mechanisms. They're the points in the design that you want to monitor. And then basically, as the emulation runs, it just monitors those FDNs every time you run it, saves that away. If there's a pass or a fail, it records that back to the database after some light classification. You complete your fault campaign, and then Safety Scope will eventually take over once everything's done to do the final correlation and safety metric analysis.
So, what kind of logical fault types does this app support?
So we support injecting faults in both logic. So that would be your logical types, would be your sequential type of logic, your clock, and your combinatorial logic. And we also support injecting faults into memory logic. But we support pretty much all of the standard fault models that the industry is using. So the stuck at, the transient faults. We support bridge faults where you're taking two nets, let's say, that are physically close to each other, and a fault in one net could inductively or capacitively induce a fault on a net that's right next to it or something like that. And then we also support the charged particle deposition, the SEU fault type.
What about memory faults?
Okay, so memory faults are a little bit different just because memory is a very different structure than a logical fault. So we support the standard stuck at type. We also support the standard transient fault. And then finally, we built out the single event upset because memory can be tough to understand what value is currently in the memory. So what we did is we built this concept of single event upset flip. which basically at its bottom line, it is a single event upset. Think of it as a charged particle deposition, except what we do is we just take whatever's in the memory. So if there's a 1 in the memory, the fault just becomes a 0. It just becomes the opposite.
So, can we also take a look at the runtime flow of the Veloce Fault app as well?
So after the design has been compiled, you have all of your fault injection nets declared. You have all of your safety nets, that's your FDNs declared. We now can begin our fault campaign. So as I mentioned earlier, we do a single pass run with the stimulus to take a look at how the stimulus is supposed to behave in the absence of faults. Basically, we record cycle for cycle all of the FDN states. We save that away into a database that's going to be used offline for comparison. Then what we'll do is we start the fault campaign by injecting faults. So we'll inject a fault, we'll run the stimulus, we'll see what happens to that stimulus. Any deviation from the golden run gets tagged. So it could be an FDN, it could be something earlier that happens in the logic. But any of those differences, we do the comparison to the golden run, and we can generate some basic diagnostic coverage at this point. Again, all of those runs go into the database, but it is the safety scope tool that now will analyze that database across all the different sessions, across all the different execution engines, the IPs, the blocks, so on and so forth, and generate the final ASIL coverage metric.
So, how can we monitor the fault campaign progress and results of the campaign?
Okay, so that's a good point. There's a lot of data being generated during a typical fault campaign. You have to map the fault, you have to map the stimulus, you have to map the various results of that stimulus. So what we've created is in combination with a Siemens visualizer tool, a GUI mode that will read the functional safety database and basically spell out all of the available information that's in there. So you can see all of your sessions. You can have hierarchical browsing of the fault nests so that you can see at an IP by IP, hierarchy by hierarchy level. And it provides a final summary and a fault classification report. So it gives the user a very nice, simple view of everything that's happening in the fault campaign Fusa database. And then we also provide another view, which is a very, very high level view. This is what really the functional safety manager kind of view wants to see. The last view is more of a technical engineering type of view, but they just want to be able to see at a very high level how many faults. In this instance, we have 57% of the faults were multi-point and 86% of the faults were safe. So what this basically does is just give a quick snapshot of where we are on a day-to-day level with your fault campaign to see, did you make your ASIL level? Does more work have to be done? And things along those lines.
That makes sense. Now, Robert, what are the main benefits of this app for fault campaign management?
Okay, so one of the things that we've noticed in the industry, and Siemens EDA was the first to come out with this, where again the individual point tools from different vendors, coupled with internal scripts and internal handwritten software and things like that, became unmanageable. It's just too much work. So Siemens came out. We looked across the company and said, what can we do with all of the tools we currently have? So as Ann mentioned, the safety scope and the kaleidoscope, the Veloce Fault App, and even some of the work that we're doing in Questa. And we said, how do we tie all of these different point tools together? So we came up with this idea of the functional safety database. Now we're able to very easily exchange data between all of these tools. They all speak the same language. You have a traceability path. So when it comes time to do your final report and classificate your ISO 26262 certification, you have all of that information documented and right there in the functional safety database. We also have some utilities where we can merge fault reports across different runs. As Ann mentioned, there's an early and metric analysis to really optimize your safety architecture. And finally, with our visualizer tool, we give the user a very simple and easy way to just view at multiple levels where they're at in their fault campaign.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's all I have time for today. Thank you so much for joining me, Robert.
Thank you, Amelia.
And thank you for joining me, Anne.
Thank you very much.
And before we go, you didn't forget to click that link, did you? There you can find even more information about this topic from Siemens EDA. For Chalk Talks, I'm Amelia Dalton from eejournal.com. For more Chalk Talks, head on over to the Chalk Talk section of EE Journal. You can't miss it, it's right across the top. Or head on over to YouTube, youtube.com/